Welcome to History for Snooze, where the past becomes your lullaby. Here, we explore the calm side of history, the quiet stories, the forgotten moments, and the everyday lives that shaped our world. No loud battles, no shocking twists, just peaceful journeys through time, told slowly to help you relax, unwind, and maybe even drift into sleep. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to tell me, where in the world are you listening from? I'd love to know how far our sleepy stories travel. And if you enjoy relaxing with history, don't forget to tap that subscribe button and join our growing family of calm minds and curious dreamers. Now, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin our journey into the soft echoes of the past. This is History for Snooze. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, presented extraordinary challenges to the common people of Europe. Among these challenges, surviving the brutal winters stood as one of the most formidable tests of human endurance and ingenuity. For the peasantry, who constituted approximately 90% of the medieval population, winter was not merely an inconvenience but a life-threatening season that demanded every ounce of resourcefulness, community cooperation, and practical knowledge passed down through generations. Unlike the nobility who resided in stone castles with multiple fireplaces, tapestries for insulation, and access to abundant resources, medieval peasants faced winter with limited materials, cramped living conditions, and the constant specter of starvation. Yet these resilient people developed sophisticated strategies for thermal retention, food preservation, and communal survival that allowed human civilization to persist through some of the coldest periods in recorded history, including the medieval warm period's end and the beginning of the Little Ice Age. This comprehensive examination explores not only the specific techniques peasants employed to survive frigid nights, but also the broader context of their lives, their homes, their food systems, their social structures, their spiritual beliefs, and their remarkable adaptability in the face of environmental extremes that would challenge even modern humans accustomed to central heating and insulated homes. The early medieval period, from approximately 950 to 1250 CE, experienced what climatologists call the medieval warm period or medieval climate anomaly. During this time, temperatures in Europe were somewhat warmer than the preceding centuries, allowing for expanded agriculture, population growth, and even Viking settlements in Greenland. Vineyards flourished in England, and crop yields increased across the continent. However, this relatively benign climate began to deteriorate in the 13th century, culminating in the onset of the Little Ice Age around 1300. This climatic shift brought dramatically colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and increased precipitation that often came as devastating snow and ice. The transition period saw some of the worst weather-related disasters in European history, including the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which was triggered by excessive rain and cold that destroyed crops across northern Europe. Medieval winters could be brutally cold by any standard. Historical records, though incomplete, provide glimpses of the severity. Chroniclers reported rivers and harbors freezing solid, allowing people and carts to cross on ice. The Thames in London froze multiple times during the medieval period, with the first recorded frost fair occurring in 1309. The Baltic Sea froze in 1303 and 1306 to 1307, allowing wolves to cross from Sweden to Denmark on the ice. Indoor temperatures in peasant homes during winter nights regularly dropped to near freezing or below. Without effective insulation or adequate heating, the interior of a typical peasant cottage might be only marginally warmer than the outside air. when outdoor temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit or lower during severe cold snaps, survival became a minute-by-minute challenge. The seasonal variation in daylight also compounded the difficulties. In Northern Europe, winter days were short, with only 7 or 8 hours of weak sunlight. This meant long periods of darkness when no work could be done and when the cold seemed most oppressive. Peasants had to survive 15 or 16 hours of nighttime, burning precious fuel and enduring the psychological weight of endless dark winter nights. The medieval experience of winter varied considerably across Europe's diverse geography. In Scandinavia and the mountainous regions of Scotland, the Alps, and the Pyrenees, winters were particularly harsh, with deep snow cover lasting for months. Peasants in these regions developed specialized adaptations, including semi-subterranean homes that utilized Earth's insulating properties and close relationships with livestock for mutual warmth. In the Mediterranean regions of southern France, Italy, and Iberia, winters were milder but still challenging, particularly in upland areas. These regions face different problems: less severe cold but more variable weather, including destructive storms and occasional hard freezes that could destroy crops not adapted to such conditions. The lowlands of northern France, the Low Countries, England, and northern Germany experienced moderately cold winters made worse by dampness and wind. The humid climate meant that cold penetrated more deeply, and the risk of illnesses related to damp conditions was ever present. Marshlands and river valleys were particularly challenging environments, with fog, mist, and persistent moisture compounding the effects of low temperatures. Eastern European peasants faced continental winters with extreme temperature drops, though often with less precipitation than their Western counterparts. The dry cold of the eastern plains required different survival strategies than the wet cold of Atlantic Europe. The typical medieval peasant dwelling was a far cry from the romanticized cottages of modern imagination. Most were simple, single-room structures measuring approximately 15 to 20 feet long and 10 to 15 feet wide, roughly 150 to 300 square feet of living space for an entire family that might include 6 to 8 people or more. Construction methods varied by region and available materials. In heavily forested areas, timber framing was common, with walls filled in using wattle and daub, a mixture of woven wooden strips, wattle, covered with a plaster made from clay, mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung, daub. This method provided some insulation but was far from weatherproof, especially as the daub cracked and eroded over time. In regions where stone was plentiful, such as parts of Scotland, Wales, and mountainous areas, peasants built stone cottages with thick walls that provided better insulation. However, even stone construction had its drawbacks. Stones conducted cold, and without proper mortar, which was expensive and often unavailable to poor peasants, gaps between stones allowed wind and moisture to penetrate. In areas with limited wood and stone, peasants constructed homes using turf or sod. These structures were built by stacking blocks of earth and grass, creating walls that were excellent insulators but prone to water damage and requiring constant maintenance. Some of the poorest peasants lived in structures that were little more than holes dug into hillsides, covered with turf roofs, essentially human burrows. The roof was perhaps the most critical element of peasant housing, as it protected inhabitants from rain, snow, and wind. Thatched roofs made from straw, reeds, or heather were the most common solution. A well-made thatched roof could last 15 to 25 years and provided surprisingly good insulation when properly maintained and sufficiently thick, often 2 feet or more of compacted thatch. The technique of thatching required considerable skill. Bundles of straw or reed were laid in overlapping rows, starting at the bottom edge of the roof and working upward, with each layer secured by wooden rods or rope made from twisted plant fibers. The steep pitch of thatched roofs, usually at least 45 degrees, allowed rain and snow to run off quickly, preventing water penetration and the resulting rot. However, thatch had significant disadvantages. It was highly flammable, and house fires were a constant danger, especially in winter when hearth fires burned continuously. Thatch also harbored vermin, including mice, rats, and various insects. The expression "dirt poor" may have originated from the dust and debris that continuously fell from thatched roofs onto the inhabitants below. In wealthier peasant households or in regions where materials were available, wooden shingles or clay tiles provided more durable, fire-resistant roofing, though these were beyond the means of most poor peasants. The roof was perhaps the most critical element of peasant housing, as it protected inhabitants from rain, snow, and wind. Thatched roofs made from straw, reeds, or heather were the most common solution. A well-made thatched roof could last 15 to 25 years and provided surprisingly good insulation when properly maintained and sufficiently thick. The technique of thatching required considerable skill. Bundles of straw or reed were laid in overlapping rows, starting at the bottom edge of the roof and working upward, with each layer secured by wooden rods or rope made from twisted plant fibers. The steep pitch of thatched roofs, usually at least 45 degrees, allowed rain and snow to run off quickly, preventing water penetration and the resulting rot. However, thatch had significant disadvantages. It was highly flammable, and house fires were a constant danger, especially in winter when hearth fires burned continuously. Thatch also harbored vermin, including mice, rats, and various insects. The expression "dirt poor" may have originated from the dust and debris that continuously fell from thatched roofs onto the inhabitants below. In wealthier peasant households or in regions where materials were available, wooden shingles or clay tiles provided more durable, fire-resistant roofing, though these were beyond the means of most poor peasants. Windows, doors, and heat loss. Medieval peasant homes typically had few windows, and those that existed were small, often just a few inches across. Glass was a luxury far beyond peasant means until the very late medieval period, so window openings were either left open, allowing wind and cold to enter, covered with waxed cloth or thin animal membranes, which admitted some light while partially blocking wind, or shuttered with wooden boards. Most peasants kept shutters closed throughout winter, preferring darkness to cold. This meant living in almost complete darkness except for the dim light from the hearth fire or rush lights and tallow candles. The psychological impact of spending months in dimly lit, smoky interiors should not be underestimated. Doors were another major source of heat loss. Simple wooden doors, hung on leather hinges or wooden pivots, rarely fit tightly in their frames. Gaps around doors allowed cold drafts to penetrate constantly. Many peasants hung heavy cloth curtains inside doors or stuffed gaps with straw or rags to reduce air infiltration. In the coldest weather, families might block the door entirely from the inside with stacked materials, essentially sealing themselves in until morning. The floor was typically packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes, straw, or reeds that provided minimal insulation from the cold ground. Wealthier peasants might have flagstone floors, which were easier to keep clean but conducted cold more effectively. The earthen floor had one advantage. It could be excavated slightly below ground level, taking advantage of the earth's natural insulation and thermal mass. The heart of every peasant home was the hearth, the source of heat, light, and cooking fire. In the simplest cottages, the hearth was nothing more than a fire pit in the center of the single room, with smoke rising to exit through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. This central placement had the advantage of radiating heat in all directions, though it also meant that the entire home filled with smoke. Archaeological evidence suggests that central hearths were often lined with stones or clay to contain the fire and protect the earthen floor. Some hearths were slightly raised on a platform of clay and stones, improving draft and making cooking somewhat easier. Around the hearth, the floor became hard and baked from constant heat exposure. The open hearth created a peculiar living environment. The upper portions of the room filled with smoke, which eventually found its way out through roof openings. Peasants learned to live in the lower, clearer air, often spending time sitting or lying rather than standing. The smoke had some benefits. It helped to preserve food hung from the rafters, deterred insects, and may have had some antimicrobial properties. However, it also caused respiratory problems, eye irritation, and probably contributed to reduced life expectancy. By the later medieval period, some peasant homes featured more advanced heating systems. Wealthy peasant families might have a hearth built against a wall with a rudimentary chimney, a hood that funneled smoke upward and out of the living space. However, even these chimneys were primitive by modern standards, often just a wooden frame covered with clay that posed a constant fire risk. Medieval peasants employed various strategies to improve their homes' insulation and reduce heat loss. One common method was to allow the wattle and daub walls to become covered with soot from the hearth fire. The smoke particles actually improved the weather resistance of the walls, filling tiny cracks and creating a somewhat water-resistant surface. In autumn, before winter's onset, conscientious peasants replastered damaged sections of walls, replaced worn thatch, and generally prepared their homes for the cold season ahead. Gaps between wall and roof were stuffed with moss, straw, or clay. Some peasants even plastered the interior walls with clay mixed with animal dung, which provided additional insulation as well as a smoother, more cleanable surface. Hanging textiles on walls, when peasants could afford them, provided another layer of insulation. Even rough cloth or old sacks hung on walls created a dead air space that reduced heat loss. Wealthier peasants might accumulate old grain sacks, worn-out clothing, or rough cloth specifically for this purpose. During the coldest nights, some families would hang cloth or hides to create an internal partition, effectively making their living space smaller and easier to heat. This might reduce the living area to just the space immediately around the hearth, with the rest of the cottage effectively abandoned to the cold until spring. Wood was the primary fuel for heating and cooking throughout most of medieval Europe, but access to wood varied dramatically based on social status, location, and local customs. Forests were often controlled by nobility or monastic institutions, and peasants' rights to collect firewood were strictly regulated through complex systems of forest law. In England, peasants might have rights to collect fallen wood, dead wood, but were forbidden from cutting living trees. The penalties for illegally felling trees could be severe, including fines that a peasant family could never hope to pay, physical punishment, or even death in extreme cases. These restrictions meant that peasants had to carefully manage their wood collection, gathering fallen branches, dead trees, and brush throughout the year and storing it for winter use. The amount of wood needed to heat even a small cottage through winter was substantial, several cords at minimum. A cord of wood, measuring 4 feet high, 8 feet long, and 4 feet deep, provides about 128 cubic feet of fuel. A peasant family might need 3 to 5 cords to survive winter, representing countless hours of labor in collecting, transporting, and processing wood. In regions where wood was scarce, such as the Scottish Highlands, the fens of eastern England, or treeless uplands, peasants relied on alternative fuels. Peat was perhaps the most important wood substitute. Cut from bogs in spring and summer, dried in stacked formations called peat stacks. Peat could provide substantial heat, though it burned with more smoke and a distinctive odor. Regions with peat bogs developed entire cultures around peat cutting, with specialized tools and techniques passed down through generations. Dried animal dung was another important fuel source, particularly in pastoral regions. Cattle and sheep dung was collected, formed into cakes, and dried in the sun. While it burned at a lower temperature than wood and produced more smoke, dung fuel was renewable and often freely available to those who kept livestock. Mixed with straw or dried grass, dung cakes could burn for extended periods, making them economical for maintaining overnight fires. In coastal areas, peasants collected driftwood and seaweed for fuel. Some also burned dried kelp, which was particularly useful for communities that practiced kelp farming. In truly desperate times, peasants might burn agricultural waste like corn stalks after threshing, dried gorse or furze bushes, or even old thatch removed from roofs during repairs. Maintaining fire was a constant concern and a specialized skill. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming, involving striking flint against iron to create sparks that would ignite tinder, typically charcloth, dried fungus, or finely shredded plant material. Once a spark caught in the tinder, it had to be carefully nursed into flame and then transferred to kindling. Because of the difficulty of starting fires, peasants tried never to let their hearth fires go completely out. The practice of fire-keeping was an essential household responsibility, usually assigned to women or older children. Before going to sleep, someone would carefully bank the fire by covering the embers with ash, which insulated them and slowed combustion while preventing complete extinguishment. In the morning, these embers could be uncovered, fed with tinder and kindling, and brought back to full flame. A successfully banked fire could remain alive for 12 to 16 hours or more with no attention. The skill lay in burying just enough coals with just enough ash. Too little ash and the fire would burn out, too much and it would smother. This was knowledge that every peasant child learned from an early age. If a fire did go out, a family had to either laboriously restart it using flint and steel or borrow fire from a neighbor. Carrying fire from one household to another was done using a fire iron, a metal container with ventilation holes that could safely transport live coals. Some communities maintained a perpetual fire in a central location, such as a church or manor house, from which villagers could obtain fire if their own went out. The social significance of fire borrowing should not be underestimated. It created bonds of obligation and reciprocity among neighbors. Refusing to share fire was considered deeply antisocial and could result in ostracism. Conversely, the inability to maintain one's own fire was seen as a sign of poor household management and brought shame upon a family. Medieval peasants developed various techniques to maximize the heat output from their limited fuel. One method was to use fire dogs, andirons, metal supports that held logs above the hearth floor, allowing air to circulate beneath and improving combustion. However, metal implements were expensive, and many poor peasants simply laid their fuel directly on the hearth or supported logs with stones. Radiant heat reflectors, when available, could dramatically improve heating efficiency. A metal sheet or even a flat stone placed behind the fire would reflect heat back into the living space rather than allowing it to escape up the chimney or through the roof. Some households used this principle by positioning the hearth against a wall, which then stored and re-radiated heat. Peasants also understood the principle of thermal mass, even if they didn't use such terminology. Large stones placed in or near the fire would absorb heat and continue radiating it long after the fire burned down. Similarly, heated stones could be wrapped in cloth and used as bed warmers, carrying precious warmth away from the hearth to sleeping areas. In extreme cold, some families maintained small, portable braziers, metal containers that held hot coals. These could be moved around the living space to provide spot heating where needed. However, braziers posed significant risks of carbon monoxide poisoning and fire, so they had to be used with extreme caution. Cooking and heating integration. The hearth served the dual purpose of heating and cooking, and peasants carefully managed this integration. Cooking was typically done during daylight hours when the household was active and could tend the fire. The heat produced while cooking helped warm the home during the day, and cooking generated additional warmth from the metabolic heating of food preparation activities. Cooking methods were designed to maximize both nutritional value and heat production. Pottage, a thick soup or stew, was the staple meal of medieval peasants, and it required long, slow cooking. A cauldron of pottage suspended over the fire on a chain or resting on stones would simmer for hours, providing both food and heat. The cauldron itself became heated and radiated warmth into the room. Baking bread presented particular challenges and opportunities. Most peasants did not have ovens in their homes. Instead, they used communal ovens, usually operated by the manor and subject to fees, or made flatbreads on heated stones or griddles at their hearth. When communal ovens were used, peasants would time their baking to coincide with when the oven was hottest, after the day's bread baking was done but while substantial heat remained. Some wealthier peasants had built-in ovens adjacent to their hearths, essentially a stone or clay dome heated by the hearth fire. After being thoroughly heated, the coals could be raked out and bread or other items placed inside to cook in the retained heat. These ovens continued to radiate warmth into the home for hours after cooking was finished. The dangers of fire. While fire was essential for survival, it was also one of the greatest threats to medieval peasants. House fires were terrifyingly common and could spread rapidly through thatched roofs and wooden structures. An entire village could be destroyed in hours if fire broke out in windy conditions. Various factors contributed to fire risk. Thatched roofs were essentially kindling waiting to ignite. Sparks from hearth fires could drift upward and lodge in thatch. Rendering fat for tallow candles, a common winter activity, posed particular risks as hot fat could spill or ignite. Even the soot accumulation in chimneys could ignite, causing chimney fires that might spread to the roof structure. Medieval communities developed fire safety practices born from bitter experience. Many villages had regulations requiring householders to cover their fires at night with a curfew, a metal cover that reduced oxygen supply and prevented sparks from escaping. The word curfew itself derives from the French couvre-feu, cover fire, and the practice of evening fire covering evolved into the broader concept of curfew times. Water buckets were kept ready, and in winter, snow could be used to fight fires. However, once a fire gained hold in a thatched roof, it was usually impossible to save the structure. Efforts focused instead on preventing spread to neighboring buildings. This communal firefighting duty was taken seriously, as a fire in one cottage threatened the entire village. Carbon monoxide poisoning from inadequate ventilation also posed risks, though medieval peasants would not have understood the mechanism. The symptoms, headaches, dizziness, nausea, and eventual unconsciousness, were likely attributed to bad air or evil influences. The practice of maintaining some ventilation, even in winter, may have developed empirically as households learned that completely sealing buildings led to illness and death. Peasant clothing was designed for durability and functionality rather than fashion, but it also played a crucial role in cold weather survival. The primary material was wool, which remained the foundation of peasant wardrobes throughout the medieval period due to its availability, warmth, and water resistance. The basic male peasant outfit consisted of a linen or hemp undertunic, shirt, worn next to the skin, covered by a wool tunic reaching to mid-thigh or knee, wool hose, leg coverings, and shoes or boots. In cold weather, additional layers could be added: a second tunic, a hooded cloak or mantle, and wrappings for hands and feet. Women wore a similar layered system: a linen chemise as an undergarment, covered by a wool kirtle, dress, often with an overdress or apron for work. Married women covered their hair with linen wimples or wool hoods. In winter, women also wore wool cloaks or shawls. The quality and quantity of clothing varied enormously based on economic status. A prosperous peasant might own several changes of clothing, allowing rotation while garments were washed or mended. Poor peasants might have only one set of outer clothes, worn continuously and patched repeatedly until they disintegrated into rags. Color was typically natural or muted. Undyed wool came in shades of white, gray, brown, and black, depending on the sheep's fleece. Simple plant dyes could produce yellows, browns, and greens, but vibrant colors were expensive and generally associated with higher social classes. Sumptuary laws in some regions explicitly forbade peasants from wearing certain colors or fabrics reserved for nobility. Shoes were a particular concern in winter. The poorest peasants went barefoot year-round, though this was undoubtedly miserable in winter snow and ice. Simple leather shoes, if a peasant could obtain them, provided basic protection but offered little insulation. Shoes wore out quickly given the rough terrain and constant use, and replacing them was a significant expense. Some peasants made crude shoes from wood or wrapped their feet in cloth or leather strips. Straw stuffed into shoes provided insulation, and peasants learned to keep their feet as dry as possible, as wet feet in cold weather could quickly lead to frostbite or immersion foot, trench foot. The association between wet feet and illness was well understood, even if the mechanisms were not. Nighttime sleeping arrangements. Sleeping arrangements in peasant cottages were cramped by modern standards but provided crucial warmth through body heat sharing. The entire family typically slept together in a single sleeping area, often little more than a raised platform filled with straw and covered with whatever textiles were available: old clothing, rough blankets, animal hides, or sacks. The practice of co-sleeping extended beyond immediate family. It was common for multiple generations to sleep together, and household servants, apprentices, or lodgers would join the family sleeping area. In the coldest weather, even the social barriers between family members and employees dissolved as survival demanded sharing warmth. Straw served as the primary mattress material for most peasants. Fresh straw provided reasonable comfort and insulation when piled thickly enough, at least 6 to 12 inches deep. However, straw harbored fleas, lice, and other vermin. It also became compacted over time, losing its insulating properties and becoming uncomfortable. Peasants refreshed their straw bedding periodically, with old straw being used for animal bedding or fuel. Wealthier peasants might have mattress ticks, cloth sacks filled with straw, chaff, or rarely feathers. These provided more consistent insulation and were easier to maintain clean than loose straw. However, most peasants slept directly on straw strewn on a wooden platform or on the floor. Blankets and coverings were precious possessions. Wool blankets, when available, provided excellent insulation even when damp. Many peasants used their cloaks as blankets, and any available textile, worn-out clothing, grain sacks, even sheepskins, might be pressed into service as bedding. In truly impoverished households, people slept in their day clothes and used straw piled on top of them for covering. The practice of wearing caps, hoods, or head coverings to bed was common and sensible, as significant body heat is lost through the head. Some peasants wrapped their heads in wool cloth or wore their hoods throughout the night. Similarly, keeping feet covered was critical, and those who had them wore their hose or wrapped their feet in cloth. Heating the bed. Various methods were employed to warm beds before sleeping. The most common was the bed warmer, a long-handled metal pan with a perforated lid that could hold hot coals. This would be run between the bedding shortly before sleep, warming the textiles and driving out dampness. However, metal bed warmers were expensive, and many peasants lacked them. Alternative methods included heating stones or bricks in the hearth fire, then wrapping them in cloth and placing them in the bed. These thermal masses could stay warm for several hours. Some peasants heated bags of grain or dried peas, which retained heat effectively and molded comfortably around the body. In some regions, earthenware bottles or jugs filled with hot water served as primitive hot water bottles. The risk of burns or scalding was real, so containers had to be well wrapped and placed carefully. Despite the risks, the comfort of a hot stone or bottle on a freezing night was treasured. A more elaborate practice involved heating a flat stone or piece of metal in the fire, then placing it under the bed to radiate heat upward through the straw and bedding. This provided gentle warmth for a portion of the night without the risk of direct contact burns. Body heat sharing and sleeping positions. The physics of body heat sharing meant that sleeping positions and arrangements were carefully considered, even if the principles were understood only empirically. Sleeping in close contact with others significantly reduced heat loss through radiation and convection. Multiple bodies in contact created a warm microclimate within the bedding. Families typically slept in clusters, with the youngest and oldest, who were most vulnerable to cold, positioned in the middle where they benefited from heat from all sides. Adults took positions on the edges, serving as buffers against the cold air. This arrangement also placed the most capable people in positions where they could respond quickly to emergencies like fire or intrusion. In some households, head-to-foot sleeping arrangements were used to maximize space, though this was less effective for heat sharing than lying parallel. The specific arrangements depended on family size, bed size, and personal preference. The communal sleeping arrangement, while necessary for survival, had obvious drawbacks for privacy, spread of disease, and personal space. However, medieval peasants had different expectations of privacy than modern people. The concept of individual sleeping spaces for children or separate beds for spouses was alien to most peasant families and would have seemed wasteful of precious heat. A distinctive feature of many peasant cottages was the inclusion of livestock within the living space. This practice, common throughout Northern Europe, served multiple purposes. It protected valuable animals from theft and predators, allowed constant monitoring of pregnant or sick animals, and most importantly, provided supplemental heat. Large animals like cattle, oxen, or horses generate considerable metabolic heat. A single cow produces approximately 1,000 watts of heat, equivalent to a modern space heater. In a small, enclosed space, this heat contribution was significant. Some peasant cottages were specifically designed with a divided interior, a living area for humans and an adjacent or lower area for animals, with strategic openings allowing heat to flow from the animal space to the human area while keeping the species somewhat separated. The arrangement also allowed peasants to tend their animals throughout the night if necessary. A cow in labor, a sick sheep, or animals needing feeding could be attended without venturing into the brutal outdoor cold. This was particularly important during snowstorms or extreme cold snaps when even brief exposure could be dangerous. However, living in close quarters with animals had serious health consequences. Zoonotic diseases, illnesses that spread from animals to humans, were common. Respiratory problems were exacerbated by animal dander and the ammonia from urine. The concentration of fleas, lice, mites, and other parasites was enormous. Yet these health costs were balanced against the immediate benefit of survival through cold that might otherwise be fatal. Clothing maintenance and winter wear. Maintaining clothing in good repair was essential work throughout the year, but particularly critical before winter. Holes in garments allowed cold air to penetrate and dramatically reduced clothing's insulating value. Mending and patching were constant activities, usually performed by women and girls during evening hours by hearth light. Wool's natural lanolin provided some water resistance, but this diminished with wear and washing. Some peasants treated wool garments with additional fat or oil to improve water resistance, crucial for those who had to work outside in winter weather. However, this made garments smell strongly and could leave oily marks on anything they contacted. Layering was the key strategy for cold weather warmth. Rather than single heavy garments, peasants wore multiple layers that trapped air between them. This also allowed adjustment to changing conditions. Layers could be added or removed as needed throughout the day. Extremities required special attention. Hands were protected by mittens when possible, mittens being warmer than gloves because fingers shared warmth. Simple mittens could be fashioned from wool scraps or old clothing. The wealthiest peasants might have leather gloves, but these were prized possessions. Feet presented the greatest challenge. Wet, cold feet were a constant misery and posed serious health risks. Peasants learned to carry extra foot wrappings to replace wet ones during the day. Those working outside might use wooden clogs that kept feet above mud and snow, though clogs provided no insulation themselves. Head coverings were essential. Wool hoods or caps, often attached to cloaks, protected against wind and retained body heat. The practice of wearing hoods at night in bed has already been mentioned, but they were equally important during the day when working outside. Understanding how peasants survived cold nights requires understanding their annual food production cycle. Medieval peasant agriculture followed seasonal patterns that had been refined over centuries, with each season's work laying groundwork for winter survival. Spring was the season of planting and renewal. Peasants sowed spring grains like oats and barley, tended growing crops, and managed the hungry gap, the period between winter's stored food running low and new crops becoming available. This was often the most difficult time of year, when starvation was most likely. Summer brought intensive agricultural labor. Haymaking was critical, as hay fed livestock through winter. Grain crops required constant attention, weeding, protecting from birds and animals, monitoring for disease. Gardens provided fresh vegetables, and wild foods could be gathered. Autumn was harvest season, the culmination of the year's agricultural work. The grain harvest was a community effort, with all hands needed to bring in crops before weather could destroy them. After grains came root vegetable harvests, turnips, parsnips, carrots. Autumn was also the season of slaughter, when animals that couldn't be fed through winter were killed and their meat preserved. Winter was theoretically a time of rest, though cold weather brought its own labors, maintaining shelter, feeding animals, processing food, making and repairing tools and clothing. Winter was also when peasants paid their social obligations, performing labor for lords during periods when field work was impossible. This cycle meant that the food available during winter, the season of highest caloric need, was entirely what had been stored from previous seasons. There were no fresh vegetables, limited fresh meat from preserved livestock, and complete dependence on stored grains and preserved foods. The medieval peasant diet. The core of the peasant diet was grain, primarily in the form of bread and pottage. Bread was the staff of life, providing the bulk of calories for most peasants. However, the bread consumed by peasants was far different from modern bread. It was typically made from rye or a mixture of grains including barley, oats, and wheat, the latter being too expensive for regular peasant consumption. Peasant bread was dense, heavy, and dark. It might include not just grain flour but also ground peas, beans, or even acorns or bark when grain was scarce. The texture was coarse, and loaves might weigh several pounds. Bread was often baked in large batches and stored, becoming increasingly hard over time. Stale bread might be softened in liquid or used as trenchers, edible plates that absorbed meat juices. Pottage was perhaps even more central to peasant diet than bread. This thick soup or stew was made by boiling grains, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables, herbs, or meat scraps were available in a cauldron of water. Pottage could be thin or thick depending on what went into it, and it was continuously replenished, new ingredients added as portions were consumed, so that the pot never fully emptied. A pottage might simmer for days or weeks, developing complex flavors. In winter, pottage became especially important. It made efficient use of fuel, as one fire could cook a large quantity that would feed the family multiple meals. It provided hot food that warmed the body from within, an often overlooked aspect of cold weather survival. The thermogenic effect of eating hot food temporarily increased metabolic rate and provided both physical and psychological comfort. Vegetables in the peasant diet varied by season and region. In winter, the choices were limited to stored root vegetables and preserved items. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, and leeks could be stored in root cellars or buried in sand or earth to prevent freezing. Cabbage and kale could withstand early frosts and might remain available into early winter. Dried peas and beans were dietary staples, providing crucial protein when meat was unavailable. Meat consumption varied dramatically based on economic status and season. Most peasants ate meat rarely, perhaps once a week in good times, and far less frequently during winter and lean years. When meat was consumed, it was most often pork, from household pigs, poultry, chickens, geese, or ducks, or occasionally mutton. Beef was rare, as cattle were too valuable as draft animals and for dairy production to be regularly slaughtered for meat. The autumn slaughter provided a temporary abundance of fresh meat, but most of this had to be preserved for winter consumption. Preservation methods included salting, smoking, and drying. Salt-preserved meat could last months if kept properly, but was extremely salty and tough, requiring long soaking and cooking to become palatable. Dairy products were important when available. Milk could be consumed fresh in summer when cows were producing, but in winter production dropped dramatically or ceased. More importantly, fresh milk spoiled quickly. Preserved dairy products, cheese and butter, were more practical for long-term storage. Hard cheeses could keep for months and provided concentrated nutrition. Butter was salted and stored in crocks or barrels. Fish, particularly preserved fish, was an important dietary component, especially during Lent and other periods when the church prohibited meat consumption. Dried or salted fish, herring, cod, stockfish, was traded throughout Europe and was affordable even for poor peasants. However, like salt meat, preserved fish was tough and required long soaking and preparation. Winter food shortages and the hungry gap. Winter and early spring were times of dietary stress for most peasant households. Stored food gradually depleted, and as winter progressed, both quantity and quality of available food decreased. By late winter, families might be consuming the last of their stored grain, the poorest quality preserved foods, and anything else that could provide calories. The hungry gap in late winter and early spring was a period of genuine food scarcity. Stored grain ran low, preserved foods were exhausted, and new crops were still months away. During this period, peasants might survive on progressively less adequate diets, bread made with lower quality flour or extended with whatever could be ground to powder, thin pottages with fewer ingredients, and increasingly desperate foraging for wild foods. Malnutrition during the hungry gap weakened peasants, making them more susceptible to disease and less able to withstand cold. Weight loss was common, and the deaths that occurred in late winter were often attributable as much to gradual starvation as to cold or disease. In truly desperate times, peasants consumed famine foods, substances normally not eaten but which could provide calories. These might include acorns, which require processing to remove bitter tannins, tree bark. The inner bark of some trees could be dried and ground into flour, roots and tubers of wild plants, grass and leaves, and even clay or earth to fill empty stomachs, though these provided no nutrition. Historical records document periodic famines when widespread crop failure led to mass starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed an estimated 10 to 25% of the population in some regions. During such catastrophes, social order broke down, crime increased, and there are even documented cases of cannibalism in the most desperate circumstances. Caloric needs and metabolic challenges. The caloric demands of peasant life were substantial, particularly in winter. Agricultural labor was physically demanding, and even basic survival in cold weather required significant energy. Modern estimates suggest that medieval peasants might have needed 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily during periods of heavy labor, and even in winter, caloric needs remained high due to cold exposure. However, winter diets often provided fewer calories than summer diets, creating a metabolic mismatch. As stored foods depleted and quality deteriorated, caloric intake decreased precisely when cold weather increased caloric requirements. This seasonal energy deficit had profound effects on peasant health, work capacity, and survival. The body's response to cold includes shivering thermogenesis, involuntary muscle contractions that generate heat but consume significant calories. Prolonged cold exposure also increases basal metabolic rate as the body works to maintain core temperature. Without adequate caloric intake to support these demands, the body begins catabolizing muscle and fat reserves. For peasants living on marginal diets, there was little buffer. Weight loss during winter was common, and those who entered winter already undernourished faced the highest mortality risk. Children, the elderly, and those weakened by illness or injury were particularly vulnerable. The role of alcohol. Alcohol played a significant role in medieval peasant life and winter survival. Ale was the most common alcoholic beverage for peasants in Northern Europe, consumed daily by adults and children alike. Medieval ale was quite different from modern beer, lower in alcohol content, typically 2 to 3% ABV. Unhopped hops were not widely used until the later medieval period, and spoiling quickly. Ale served several purposes. It provided calories and some nutrients, particularly B vitamins from the yeast. It was safer than water as the brewing process killed pathogens. And it provided psychological comfort and mild intoxication that made the hardships of winter marginally more bearable. In winter, when fresh ale production was difficult, stored ale or ale made from stored grain was consumed. Some regions produced stronger ale specifically for winter consumption, as higher alcohol content provided some preservation. The production of ale was typically women's work, and skilled alewives were valued members of the community. Wine was consumed in regions where grapes grew, particularly southern Europe. In wine-producing regions, even poor peasants might have access to low-quality wine or the dregs and lees left from better wine production. Like ale, wine provided calories and made contaminated water safer to drink. Spirits, distilled liquor, were known in the later medieval period but were expensive and generally beyond peasant means. They were primarily used medicinally rather than for regular consumption. The consumption of alcohol in winter had both benefits and drawbacks. The caloric content and perceived warming effect were beneficial, but alcohol actually increases heat loss from the body by causing vasodilation, expanding blood vessels near the skin surface. The feeling of warmth from drinking is illusory and can be dangerous in extreme cold. However, the social and psychological benefits of shared drinking, particularly during dark winter evenings, should not be dismissed. Nutritional deficiencies and their consequences. The medieval peasant diet, particularly in winter, was deficient in several essential nutrients. Understanding these deficiencies helps explain the health problems common among medieval peasants and their reduced capacity to withstand cold stress. Vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, was probably widespread by late winter, though it may not have progressed to the extreme symptoms seen in sailors on long voyages. Fresh fruits and vegetables, the primary sources of vitamin C, were absent from winter diets. Some vitamin C could be obtained from stored root vegetables and from wild plants gathered when weather permitted, but these were marginal sources. Symptoms of mild scurvy include fatigue, weakness, joint pain, and poor wound healing, all common complaints in late winter. Vitamin D deficiency was likely endemic, particularly in northern regions with limited winter sunlight. Vitamin D is synthesized in skin exposed to sunlight, and with short winter days, heavy cloud cover, and peasants spending most time indoors or heavily clothed, synthesis was minimal. Dietary vitamin D from fish, eggs, and dairy was limited in winter. Vitamin D deficiency causes muscle weakness, bone pain, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. Iron deficiency anemia was common, particularly among women of childbearing age who lost iron through menstruation and pregnancy. The peasant diet included some iron from grains and vegetables, but these plant-based iron sources are poorly absorbed compared to meat-based iron. With limited meat consumption, many peasants were chronically anemic, reducing their capacity for physical work and their ability to maintain body temperature. Protein deficiency could occur during periods of food scarcity, particularly when diets became dominated by bread and pottage with minimal additions of legumes, dairy, or meat. Protein is essential for immune function, and deficiency increased susceptibility to infections, a major cause of winter mortality. Food storage and preservation techniques. The success of winter survival depended critically on food preservation and storage. Peasants employed various techniques, many refined over centuries of experience, to maintain food supplies through the long months when no fresh food could be produced. Grain storage was the highest priority. After harvest and thresing, grain had to be kept dry and protected from rodents and insects. Larger peasant households might have granaries, dedicated structures for grain storage. More commonly, grain was stored in the home in large chests, barrels, or sacks suspended from rafters to deter rats and mice. Proper drying was essential. Damp grain would sprout or develop mold, ruining the entire store. Root cellars provided cool, stable environments for storing root vegetables and some other items. These were simply pits dug into the earth, sometimes under the cottage floor or as separate underground structures. The earth's insulation kept temperatures above freezing but cool enough to prevent spoilage. Root vegetables could be layered with sand, straw, or earth to prevent touching and moisture spread. Salting was the most important meat preservation technique. Salt drew moisture from meat, creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. Salt was expensive, representing a significant investment for peasant households, but essential for winter survival. The amount of salt needed to preserve meat was substantial, roughly 1 pound of salt per 3 pounds of meat. Smoking combined partial drying with chemical preservation from smoke compounds. Meats and fish were hung in smoky environments, often simply above the hearth fire, for days or weeks. The smoke deposited preservative compounds on the food surface while the heat slowly dried it. Smoked foods developed distinctive flavors and could keep for months. Drying was used for various foods. Fish, particularly whitefish like cod, were split, salted, and air-dried to create stockfish, rock-hard preserved fish that could last years if kept dry. Herbs could be dried for flavoring winter foods. Some fruits, if available, could be dried for preservation. Fermentation preserved various foods and created new products. Cabbage fermented with salt became sauerkraut, which could last through winter and retained more nutrients than cabbage stored fresh. Milk fermented into yogurt or kefir, both of which kept longer than fresh milk, though these were more common in Eastern Europe than in the West. Pickling in vinegar or brine preserved some vegetables, though vinegar was expensive for most peasants. Those who could afford it might pickle onions, cucumbers, or other vegetables for winter consumption. The quality of preserved foods deteriorated over the storage period. Meat preserved in autumn was at its best in early winter but became increasingly tough, dry, and rancid as winter progressed. Grain was at risk of infestation by weevils and other insects. Stored vegetables gradually withered or rotted despite best efforts. By late winter, peasants were consuming food that was marginal in quality, though it still provided calories. Medieval peasant life cannot be understood without examining the social and economic structures that governed it. The manor system, which prevailed throughout much of medieval Europe, defined relationships between peasants and the nobility who controlled the land. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked and obligated to provide labor and goods to their lord. A serf family typically worked a plot of land, their holding, for their own sustenance but owed substantial obligations to the lord. These obligations varied by region and time but generally included labor services, working the lord's fields for a set number of days per week or year, payments in kind, portions of harvest, livestock, or goods, and various fees and taxes. The level of obligation affected winter survival. Peasants who owed less labor service had more time to prepare for winter, cutting firewood, making repairs, preserving food. Those with heavy labor obligations faced difficult choices between fulfilling feudal duties and preparing their own households for winter. Some peasants had somewhat better status as freemen or free peasants, who owned or rented their land and owed less to lords, though they still had obligations to pay taxes and rents. The distinctions between serf and freeman mattered in legal and economic terms, but both groups faced similar challenges in surviving winter. The lord's resources played a role in peasant survival. A generous or practical lord might provide emergency grain during food shortages or allow peasants to take fallen wood from forests for fuel. A harsh lord might enforce forest laws strictly and demand full payment of rents and fees even in years of poor harvest. Peasant survival sometimes depended on the character and policies of their lord. Village community and mutual support. The village community was central to medieval peasant life and winter survival. Villages functioned as cooperative units where reciprocal obligations and mutual support were essential for everyone's survival. Common land rights were crucial. Most manors included commons, lands that all villagers could use for grazing animals, collecting wood, cutting peat, and gathering wild foods. These common rights provided resources that individual peasant holdings could not. During winter, common land might provide emergency fuel or grazing when private resources ran out. Work sharing and cooperative labor reduced individual burden and improved efficiency. During harvest, villagers worked together to bring in crops quickly before weather could damage them. In winter, cooperative tasks might include communal bread baking, reducing fuel needs, shared animal care, allowing different families to rest, and collective maintenance of common resources like roads or drainage systems. Resource sharing extended to emergencies. If a family's grain store was destroyed by fire or rats, neighbors would provide food to prevent starvation, with the understanding that such help would be reciprocated when others faced crisis. If someone's hearth fire went out, neighbors shared fire. If illness struck, neighbors helped with essential tasks. This wasn't pure altruism, it was enlightened self-interest. Villagers understood that everyone's survival was interconnected. A family that starved or froze represented not only human tragedy but also lost labor capacity for the entire community. Helping neighbors survive winter meant more hands available for spring planting and harvest. Social pressure enforced these cooperative norms. Those who refused to help neighbors faced ostracism, gossip, and potential exclusion from future cooperation. In a society where individual survival was nearly impossible, social exclusion could be a death sentence. Thus, even selfish individuals had strong incentives to participate in mutual aid systems. The role of the church. The medieval church played multiple roles in peasant life and winter survival. Churches were physically central to villages and spiritually central to peasant worldview, but they also provided practical support during hardship. The church calendar structured the year and influenced food consumption patterns. Fast days and Lent, when meat consumption was forbidden, affected diet but also enforced sharing of limited meat supplies. If no one could eat meat on certain days, the rich couldn't monopolize it. While this interpretation might be too functional, the religious food restrictions did have the effect of somewhat leveling consumption patterns. Parish churches might provide emergency assistance to the very poor. While the church as an institution was enormously wealthy, individual parish resources were limited. However, some parishes maintained stores of grain or funds that could support the destitute during winter. The doctrine of charity obligated Christians to help the poor, and while this obligation was often honored more in the breach than the observance, it did result in some wealth transfer to the needy. The church building itself provided a communal gathering space. Church services brought the community together regularly, reinforcing social bonds and providing opportunities for information exchange, dispute resolution, and social interaction that helped maintain community cohesion through the isolating winter months. Monasteries and convents often played more substantial charitable roles. Monastic institutions maintained larger food stores and sometimes provided food, shelter, or medical care to the destitute. The quality and extent of this charity varied enormously by institution, but the presence of a monastery could significantly improve survival prospects for the poorest members of society. Religious festivals and holy days provided breaks from winter's monotony. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas, February 2nd, were occasions for special foods, gatherings, and celebrations that boosted morale during the darkest part of winter. These festivals also often involved some redistribution of resources, as the wealthy were expected to provide special foods or entertainment for their dependents. The household was the basic unit of medieval society, but household meant something different than modern nuclear families. Medieval peasant households typically included extended family members and sometimes non-relatives. Three-generation households were common, with grandparents, parents, and children living together. This structure had advantages for winter survival. Older members contributed knowledge, skills, and labor appropriate to their abilities, while benefiting from the physical strength of younger members and the care of the middle generation. Elderly peasants who could no longer perform hard physical labor could still mind children, tend fires, prepare food, spin wool, and perform countless other tasks that contributed to household function. Their knowledge of weather patterns, folk remedies, food preservation, and craft skills was valuable. In winter, their bodies contributed heat to the communal sleeping area, and they could tend fires at night. Unmarried adult siblings or other relatives might live with a household, adding labor capacity and sharing resources. A widow or widower might move in with adult children's families. Orphan children were typically taken in by relatives or, if none existed, by other village families, sometimes formally, sometimes as unpaid labor. Larger households had better survival prospects in winter. More hands meant more tasks could be accomplished, more firewood gathered, more food preserved, better maintenance of buildings. More bodies meant more heat in the sleeping area. The economic principle of household economies of scale applied. It was more efficient to maintain one large fire and one large pot of pottage than multiple small ones. However, larger households also meant more mouths to feed. The balance between the advantages of more labor and the burden of more dependence was delicate. Households had to carefully manage their size, which was one reason why marriage often occurred later in medieval society than stereotypes suggest. People typically married only when they could establish or join a viable household. Social stratification within peasant society. Peasant society was not homogeneous. Significant stratification existed within the peasant class, and these differences affected winter survival prospects. At the top of peasant society were wealthy peasants, those with larger landholdings, multiple animals, and some capital. These families might employ servants or laborers, produce surplus for market sale, and accumulate resources that buffered them against poor harvests or hard winters. A wealthy peasant household might have a larger, better-maintained cottage with a chimney, adequate clothing for all family members, and sufficient stored food and fuel for winter. The middle tier included peasants with sufficient holdings to support their families in normal years but with little surplus. These families survived but had limited resilience. A poor harvest, the death of an animal, or unexpected expenses could push them toward poverty. Winter was challenging but manageable if previous seasons had been adequate. At the bottom were cottagers and landless laborers, peasants with little or no land, who survived by laboring for others or practicing trades. These families lived closest to the edge. Their housing was the poorest, their food supplies the most precarious, and their vulnerability to winter cold the greatest. They depended heavily on charity, gleaning rights, collecting leftover grain after harvest, and whatever work they could find. Social mobility within peasant society was limited but not impossible. A skilled craftsman might accumulate enough wealth to buy or rent land. Conversely, bad fortune could reduce a middle-tier family to poverty. These movements were usually gradual, occurring over generations rather than within a single lifetime. The differences in winter survival between wealthy and poor peasants could be stark. While no peasant lived in luxury, the difference between a cottage with adequate fuel and food versus one without could literally be the difference between life and death during severe winters. Gender roles and division of labor. Winter survival depended on the complementary labor of men and women, each performing essential tasks according to well-defined gender roles. Men's work focused on field agriculture, animal husbandry, and tasks requiring significant physical strength. In winter, men were responsible for caring for large livestock, gathering and cutting firewood, making and repairing tools and equipment, and maintaining buildings. Men also hunted or trapped small game when opportunity allowed and might perform wage labor for wealthier neighbors or the lord. Women's work centered on household management, food preparation, and textile production. Women cooked, maintained the hearth fire, made and mended clothing, spun wool or flax into thread, and often brewed ale. In winter, much of women's work involved food processing, grinding grain, preparing meals, managing food stores, and textile work, spinning, weaving, sewing. These divisions were functional rather than absolute. Women often helped with field work during harvest, and men might assist with household tasks when their labor was needed. The rigid gender separations of later periods were less pronounced in medieval peasant society, where survival demanded flexibility. Children's labor was incorporated from an early age. Young children could mind babies, collect eggs, feed poultry, and help with simple household tasks. Older children took on more responsible work. Girls learned spinning, sewing, and cooking from their mothers. Boys learned agricultural and craft skills from their fathers. By their teenage years, children were performing adult work, though perhaps not at full adult capacity. The elderly continued working as long as physically possible, shifting to less strenuous tasks as their strength declined. An elderly woman might focus on spinning or food preparation rather than heavy tasks like laundering. An elderly man might make small items or repair tools rather than cut wood or plow fields. This division of labor meant that household survival required both men and women. A household that lost its adult male through death, injury, or military service faced serious challenges. Similarly, the death of a housewife disrupted essential household functions. Widows and widowers often remarried quickly out of economic necessity, as maintaining a household alone was extremely difficult. Marriage in medieval peasant society was fundamentally an economic arrangement as much as a personal one. While affection between spouses certainly existed, the primary function of marriage was to create economically viable households capable of producing food, clothing, and shelter. Marriage typically occurred when individuals reached economic maturity, when a young man could establish a household by inheriting land, clearing new land, or securing employment, and when a young woman had mastered household skills and perhaps accumulated a small dowry of household goods or livestock. The age of marriage varied by region and time period but was generally later than commonly supposed. Men might marry in their mid to late 20s, women in their early to mid-20s. This contrasts with the image of teenage marriage that dominates popular misconception. Early marriage did occur in some circumstances, particularly among the nobility, but was less common among peasants. Marriage created a new economic unit. The couple pooled their labor and resources, dividing tasks according to gender norms while supporting each other's work. A successful marriage meant a household that could feed and clothe itself and perhaps accumulate modest surpluses. An unsuccessful marriage or widowhood threatened household viability. Children were economic assets, though they represented costs before they became productive. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. So large families were necessary to ensure that some children survived to adulthood. However, each child required food and care, and in years of scarcity, large families faced difficult choices. The household economic cycle typically began with marriage and the establishment of a new household, progressed through the raising of children who gradually became productive, reached a peak when multiple adult children were contributing labor, and declined as children married and left to form their own households, leaving aging parents with diminishing capacity. Understanding this cycle helps explain some practices that might otherwise seem harsh. Elderly parents who could no longer contribute labor might be passed among children's households, or, if they had resources, might enter into contracts of charity, where they traded their land for guaranteed care from a younger household. This wasn't callousness but economic necessity in a society with no retirement systems and where winter survival required productive labor. Medieval medical knowledge was based primarily on ancient Greek and Roman authorities, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen, filtered through Christian and Islamic interpretations. The dominant theory of disease was the system of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were believed to correspond to 4 qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Health was understood as a balance of humors, and illness resulted from imbalance. Winter cold was believed to increase phlegm, cold, and wet, leading to various illnesses. This theory, while incorrect by modern standards, led to some practical approaches. Keeping warm, consuming heating foods, and avoiding damp were all recommended and actually beneficial. Peasants' understanding of health combined folk traditions, Christian religion, and simplified versions of scholarly medicine. They recognized that cold and damp caused illness, that certain plants had healing properties, and that rest and good food aided recovery. This practical knowledge, accumulated over generations, was often surprisingly effective within its limitations. The concept of contagion existed but was poorly understood. Peasants recognized that some illnesses spread from person to person and attempted crude isolation of the sick. However, the crowded conditions of peasant cottages made isolation nearly impossible, and diseases spread rapidly through households and communities. Common winter ailments. Respiratory infections were the primary health threat in winter. The combination of cold, damp conditions, smoke-filled cottages, malnutrition, and close quarters created ideal conditions for respiratory disease spread. Colds, influenza, bronchitis, and pneumonia were common and often fatal, particularly for the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by other conditions. The smoke-filled environment of peasant cottages exacerbated respiratory problems. Chronic exposure to wood smoke caused inflammation of airways, reduced lung function, and increased susceptibility to infection. Modern studies of populations living in similar conditions show significantly higher rates of respiratory disease. Chilblains and frostbite affected extremities exposed to cold. Chilblains, painful inflammation and swelling of hands and feet, resulted from repeated exposure to cold, damp conditions. Frostbite occurred when tissue actually froze, potentially leading to gangrene and amputation if such medical intervention was available. Peasants working outside in winter weather were particularly vulnerable. Hypothermia, dangerously low core body temperature, was a real risk, especially for those caught outside in severe weather, the very young, the very old, and anyone weakened by illness or malnutrition. Mild hypothermia caused confusion, clumsiness, and weakness, Severe hypothermia led to unconsciousness and death. Gastrointestinal diseases continued through winter, though they were often more common in summer. Food poisoning from spoiled food, parasitic infections, and dysentery all occurred. In winter, these were particularly dangerous as the dehydration they caused combined with cold stress to create life-threatening situations. Skin infections and infestations were endemic. Lice, fleas, mites, and other parasites were universal among medieval peasants. These caused constant itching and discomfort but also transmitted diseases. Lice, for example, transmitted typhus, which could reach epidemic proportions. Scabies, mites burrowing into skin, was common and worsened by the inability to bathe frequently in winter. Vitamin deficiency diseases manifested by late winter. Scurvy symptoms from lack of vitamin C included fatigue, joint pain, bleeding gums, and skin problems. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency affected children, causing bone deformities. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency impaired vision in dim light, problematic during the long, dark winter evenings. Peasants treated most illnesses at home using folk remedies passed down through generations. This knowledge was primarily held by older women, who served as informal healers within their families and communities. Herbal remedies formed the core of folk medicine. Hundreds of plants were recognized as having medicinal properties, and while many were ineffective or based on magical thinking, others contained active compounds now recognized by modern medicine. Willow bark, for example, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and was used for pain and fever. Chamomile was used to aid sleep and digestion. Garlic was believed to have protective properties and does indeed have antimicrobial effects. In winter, dried herbs collected during growing season were used. Every peasant household maintained a small store of medicinal plants. More unusual or expensive herbs might be purchased from traveling peddlers or from town markets when peasants had coins to spend. Poultices and compresses were applied to wounds, swellings, and painful areas. These might contain herbs, bread soaked in liquid, honey, which has antimicrobial properties, or various other substances. While some were harmful, others probably provided genuine benefit through their active ingredients or by keeping wounds clean and protected. Dietary treatments were commonly prescribed. Certain foods were considered heating, good for cold-related illnesses, or cooling, good for fevers. Hot broths and pottages were given to sick people, providing hydration, warmth, and easily digestible nutrition, genuinely helpful approaches. Bloodletting and purging, drawn from scholarly medicine, were sometimes practiced even at the peasant level, though probably less frequently than among the wealthy who had access to trained physicians. These practices were generally harmful, weakening patients who were already ill. Prayer, religion, and healing. Medical treatment in the medieval worldview could not be separated from religion. Illness was often interpreted as divine punishment for sin or as a test of faith. Recovery required both physical treatment and spiritual intervention. Prayer was the first resort for any illness. Peasants prayed for themselves and their sick family members, invoked saints known for healing powers, and made vows to perform pilgrimages or other acts if recovery occurred. This spiritual approach wasn't just superstition. The psychological comfort of prayer and the support of religious ritual genuinely helped people cope with illness and pain. Saints were invoked for specific ailments. Saint Blaise protected against throat diseases. Saint Anthony helped with skin conditions and infections. Saint Roch was invoked against plague. Each saint had specific areas of specialization, and knowing which saint to invoke for which condition was part of common knowledge. Holy relics, bones, clothing, or objects associated with saints were believed to have healing power. While genuine relics were rare and controlled by the church, local shrines might claim smaller relics or holy wells and springs. Pilgrimage to these sites, when possible, offered hope of miraculous healing. Amulets and charms with religious symbols or words were worn for protection against illness. While the church officially condemned magical practices, the line between acceptable religious devotion and forbidden magic was blurry, and many peasants used protective charms that combined Christian and pre-Christian elements. The priest might be called to administer last rites to the dying, providing spiritual comfort and preparing the soul for death. For seriously ill peasants, the certainty that they had received the sacraments and made peace with God probably provided genuine psychological relief, even if it didn't affect physical outcomes. Birthing and infant mortality. Childbirth in winter presented particular dangers. Most births occurred at home, attended by midwives and female relatives. The cold environment complicated birthing. Mothers needed warmth, hot water for washing, and a heated space for the newborn. Midwives were experienced women, often older women past childbearing age themselves, who had learned their craft through apprenticeship. A skilled midwife understood birthing positions, knew how to handle difficult presentations, and could perform emergency interventions like manually turning a baby. However, many complications were beyond their ability to resolve, and maternal mortality was significant. Newborns were extremely vulnerable to cold. Immediate skin-to-skin contact with the mother and wrapping in warm textiles were critical. Infants were typically tightly swaddled, wrapped in cloth strips that restricted movement, which was believed to help proper development but also conserved body heat. Infant mortality was tragically high. Perhaps 20 to 30% of infants died before age 1, and another 10 to 20% died before age 5. Winter births were particularly risky. Cold stress, increased infection risk, and the mother's potentially depleted nutritional state all contributed to infant vulnerability. Breastfeeding was universal among peasants. Wet nurses were only for the wealthy, and breast milk provided the best nutrition and some immune protection for infants. However, if the mother was malnourished, milk quality and quantity suffered, compromising the infant's chances. In winter, when maternal nutrition was often poorest, infant mortality rose. The loss of children was a common grief. Nearly every woman who bore children lost at least one. While this didn't make the grief less real, medieval parents had to develop some emotional resilience to this recurring tragedy. The high mortality also meant that some parental investment in very young children was withheld until the child seemed likely to survive. Not callousness, but psychological protection. When illness struck, care fell primarily to family members, especially women. The sick were kept near the hearth for warmth, given what food could be spared, and tended as household labor allowed. In crowded cottages, isolation was impossible, so everyone was exposed to infectious diseases. After the meal, the afternoon hours continued with tasks appropriate to winter conditions. Indoor work predominated. Men might repair tools, make or mend farm implements, repair shoes, or craft wooden items. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, coopers, smiths, continued their trades during winter when agricultural labor wasn't required and demand for certain goods remained constant. Women's afternoon work centered on textile production. Spinning was continuous work. Wool or flax had to be spun into thread before it could be woven into cloth, and this task occupied countless hours. The spindle and distaff were constant companions for medieval women, and skilled spinners could work while walking, talking, or supervising children. Spinning was often done near the hearth for warmth and light. Weaving, if the household had a loom, was another winter task. Weaving required setup time and concentration but produced the cloth necessary for clothing and household textiles. Not all peasant households had looms. Weaving might be done by specialists within the village, but many households did produce at least some of their own cloth. Sewing and mending occurred continuously. Clothing wore out quickly under the hard use of peasant life, and constant repair was necessary to extend garment life. Women patched holes, reinforced worn areas, and created new garments from salvaged cloth of worn-out items. Nothing was wasted, even the smallest scraps might be used. Evening routines and night preparation. As daylight failed, which came early in winter, sometimes by mid-afternoon, activities shifted to those that could be done by firelight. The dim, flickering light of the hearth fire and perhaps rush lights or tallow candles provided minimal illumination, limiting the possible activities. The evening meal, supper, was typically lighter than dinner, perhaps bread and ale, cheese, or leftover pottage. Some poorer households might eat only one substantial meal per day in winter when food was scarce, with breakfast and supper being minimal or skipped entirely. Evening was time for social activities within the household and sometimes with neighbors. Stories were told, songs sung, news shared, and community bonds maintained. These social interactions were important for psychological well-being during the long, dark winter months. The oral tradition of medieval society, stories, ballads, folk tales, and historical narratives was preserved and transmitted during these evening gatherings. For children, evening might include instruction in prayers, moral lessons, and the stories of saints and biblical figures. Literacy was rare among peasants, but oral knowledge was extensive. Children learned the culture, history, and values of their community through these evening sessions around the hearth. Handwork continued by firelight, simple tasks that didn't require good light. Spinning continued, and men might work on carving, making rope from plant fibers, or other tasks. The goal was to keep productive while conserving expensive candles and lamp oil. Preparation for sleep began as the household settled for the night. The fire needed to be carefully banked to maintain coals until morning. This involved covering the remaining embers with ash, enough to insulate and slow combustion but not so much as to smother the fire completely. The skill of fire banking was essential and was one of the first adult responsibilities given to children. The door might be barred against intrusion and blocked with cloths or straw to prevent drafts. Shutters were secured closed. Any gaps in walls where wind penetrated might be stuffed with rags or straw. The goal was to seal the cottage as much as possible against the night's cold. Before sleeping, families would pray together. Evening prayers thanking God for the day's survival and asking protection through the night. Religion was woven into every aspect of daily life, and these prayers provided both spiritual comfort and psychological structure. Sleeping arrangements and night experiences. The entire family would then settle into their sleeping area, the straw-filled platform or simply the floor near the hearth. Bodies were arranged to maximize warmth sharing, with the most vulnerable, youngest children, the elderly, the ill, positioned in the center where they benefited from heat from all sides. Sleeping positions were often semi-upright or propped on one side, as lying flat was less practical given the thin, uneven bedding. People slept in their day clothing, possibly with additional layers added for warmth. Caps or hoods covered heads, and feet were wrapped as warmly as possible. The night was not a period of uninterrupted sleep. Cold, discomfort, the need to urinate, crying children, or animals needing attention would wake household members throughout the night. The person responsible for fire keeping might wake periodically to check that the fire hadn't died completely. In severe cold, someone might need to rise and add fuel to the fire to prevent the household from freezing. Chamber pots or buckets served as indoor toilets during the night, as going outside in winter darkness and cold was dangerous and unpleasant. These would be emptied in the morning, an unpleasant but necessary task. The night was long, 15 or 16 hours of darkness in midwinter. With no artificial light beyond the dim glow of a banked fire, there was nothing to do but sleep, huddle for warmth, and wait for dawn. The psychological impact of these endless dark nights should not be underestimated. Modern people accustomed to electric light can barely imagine the profound darkness of medieval winter nights. Sounds of the night would be heard: wind howling around the cottage, animals moving in their area, the creak and crack of the building responding to temperature changes, perhaps the sounds of neighbors in adjacent cottages if walls were thin. In villages, the church bell might ring for night prayers at monasteries, though most peasants would not wake for these. Mental illness was poorly understood. Severe mental illness might be attributed to demonic possession, divine punishment, or imbalanced humors. Treatment ranged from prayer and exorcism to herbal remedies to simple custodial care by family. Those with mental illness who could function remained in their communities. Those who couldn't were either cared for by family or, if family was unable or unwilling, might become wandering beggars. The concept of hospitals existed, but these were primarily religious institutions focused on the poor and pilgrims rather than medical treatment centers. Most were in cities or associated with monasteries, inaccessible to rural peasants. Village-level medical care was entirely informal, provided by family and folk healers. When death came, as it frequently did, the community rallied to support the bereaved family. The body would be laid out, prayers said, and burial arranged. While the church required burial in consecrated ground, usually the churchyard, and this involved fees that poor families struggled to pay, the community usually ensured that even the poorest received Christian burial. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death, particularly of children, cannot be overstated. Medieval peasants developed cultural and religious frameworks for coping with grief and loss, but the emotional burden was immense. Winter, with its increased mortality from cold, hunger, and disease, was a season of mourning as well as survival. Winter days for medieval peasants followed patterns quite different from summer's agricultural rhythms. With limited daylight and field work impossible due to frozen ground and snow, the daily routine adapted to winter's constraints and opportunities. Dawn marked the beginning of the day, though in midwinter, dawn came late. The household would awaken, likely having slept in their clothing for warmth, and someone, typically the woman of the house or an older child, would uncover the banked fire from the night before and coax it back to flame. This was a critical moment. If the fire had died completely during the night, the laborious process of starting a new fire with flint and steel would be necessary. Once the fire was re-established, the first priority was warmth. Family members would gather near the hearth, warming themselves before beginning the day's tasks. Morning prayers might be said, acknowledging God's protection through another night and asking blessing for the day ahead. Breakfast, when eaten, was simple, perhaps bread soaked in ale or milk, leftover pottage from the previous day, or simply ale or warm water flavored with herbs. Many peasants, especially the poor, might skip a formal breakfast, relying on 2 meals later in the day. The morning hours were devoted to essential tasks. Men would tend animals, feeding livestock, checking for illness or injury, milking cows if they were still producing, collecting eggs from chickens. In snowy conditions, paths had to be cleared to animal shelters and wells. Ice had to be broken to provide water for animals and household use. Women began food preparation for the day's main meal. Grain might need grinding using hand querns, simple stone mills. Bread dough mixed and set to rise, pottage ingredients prepared. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, a task made more difficult when water sources froze and ice had to be broken or snow melted. Children had their own responsibilities scaled to their age and strength. Young children might feed chickens, collect kindling, or watch younger siblings. Older children helped with adult tasks, learning skills they would need when they established their own households. Winter days for medieval peasants followed patterns quite different from summer's agricultural rhythms. With limited daylight and field work impossible due to frozen ground and snow, the daily routine adapted to winter's constraints and opportunities. Dawn marked the beginning of the day, though in midwinter, dawn came late. The household would awaken, likely having slept in their clothing for warmth, and someone, typically the woman of the house or an older child, would uncover the banked fire from the night before and coax it back to flame. This was a critical moment. If the fire had died completely during the night, the laborious process of starting a new fire with flint and steel would be necessary. Once the fire was re-established, the first priority was warmth. Family members would gather near the hearth, warming themselves before beginning the day's tasks. Morning prayers might be said, acknowledging God's protection through another night and asking blessing for the day ahead. Breakfast, when eaten, was simple, perhaps bread soaked in ale or milk, leftover pottage from the previous day, or simply ale or warm water flavored with herbs. Many peasants, especially the poor, might skip a formal breakfast, relying on 2 meals later in the day. The morning hours were devoted to essential tasks. Men would tend animals, feeding livestock, checking for illness or injury, milking cows if they were still producing, collecting eggs from chickens. In snowy conditions, paths had to be cleared to animal shelters and wells. Ice had to be broken to provide water for animals and household use. Women began food preparation for the day's main meal. Grain might need grinding using hand querns, simple stone mills. Bread dough mixed and set to rise, pottage ingredients prepared. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, a task made more difficult when water sources froze and ice had to be broken or snow melted. Children had their own responsibilities scaled to their age and strength. Young children might feed chickens, collect kindling, or watch younger siblings. Older children helped with adult tasks, learning skills they would need when they established their own households. Midday marked the primary meal of the day, dinner, typically eaten in early afternoon when there was maximum daylight. This was the largest meal, consisting usually of bread and pottage, perhaps with some cheese, preserved meat, or other additions if available. The timing of the meal depended partly on the season. In deep winter with its short days, the meal might be earlier to take advantage of what daylight existed. In late winter, as days lengthened, the meal time might shift later. The meal was a communal activity. The entire household ate together, sharing from the common pot. Holy days, feast days of saints and religious celebrations, punctuated the calendar. These were days of rest from labor and often involved special foods or small celebrations. Even in winter scarcity, households would try to mark these occasions with slightly better food or small luxuries. The liturgical calendar provided structure to the year. Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was a period of fasting and spiritual preparation. Christmas itself was a major celebration, one of the few times when special foods, ale, and festivities broke winter's monotony. Epiphany, January 6th, marked another celebration. Candlemas, February 2nd, marked the midpoint of winter and was associated with light, symbolically appropriate as days were gradually lengthening. Lent, beginning in late winter, was a period of intensified fasting and spiritual discipline. The timing was partly practical. Food stores were at their lowest in late winter anyway, so enforced fasting aligned religious observance with practical necessity. Easter, marking the end of Lent, coincided with spring's arrival and renewed food availability. This religious structuring of time helped peasants endure winter. The knowledge that Christmas would bring brief celebration, that Candlemas marked winter's midpoint, that Lent would end with Easter and spring, these temporal markers provided psychological framework for enduring the difficult months. Time perception and work patterns. Medieval peasants experienced time differently than modern people. Without clocks, which were rare and found only in churches or large towns, time was measured by natural rhythms: sunrise, sunset, the position of the sun, the tolling of church bells. The concept of hours was approximate. The day was divided into periods: morning, noon, afternoon, evening, but these were imprecise. Work was task-oriented rather than time-oriented. You worked until a task was complete or until darkness made further work impossible, not until a clock indicated your work time was finished. This pattern was well suited to agricultural life and continued in winter. Tasks expanded to fill available time, and there was always more work than time to accomplish it. However, winter's shorter days and indoor confinement did provide somewhat more leisure time than the brutal pace of summer agricultural seasons. The seasonal nature of work meant that winter was relatively less laborious than summer, though certainly not idle. The intensity of harvest season, when every hour of good weather mattered and entire communities worked sunrise to sunset to bring in crops, was absent in winter. This allowed some recovery from the physical exhaustion of the agricultural year. While every winter brought cold and hardship, some years brought extreme weather that tested peasant survival skills to their limits. These crisis events revealed both the resilience and the vulnerability of medieval peasant society. Severe cold snaps occurred when temperatures plummeted far below normal for extended periods. Historical records mention winters when rivers and harbors froze solid, when wine froze in barrels, when birds fell from the sky frozen. During such extremes, normal survival strategies became inadequate. During extreme cold, peasants had to burn more fuel than normal to maintain minimal indoor temperatures, potentially exhausting fuel reserves before winter's end. Livestock suffered terribly. Animals that normally could survive in unheated shelters might freeze to death. Water sources froze solid, requiring enormous effort to obtain water. Frostbite and hypothermia became immediate threats even for those who normally coped adequately with cold. Blizzards and heavy snowfall isolated villages and individual cottages. Deep snow made travel impossible, cutting off communities from each other and from external help. Peasants might be trapped in their cottages for days or weeks, unable to reach food stores located elsewhere, unable to gather firewood, unable to tend distant animals. Snow accumulation on roofs could cause collapse, particularly of thatched roofs weakened by age or poor maintenance. The weight of wet, heavy snow could bring down an entire roof structure, potentially burying the occupants. Peasants had to venture out during or after snowstorms to clear roofs, dangerous work in severe weather. Ice storms coated everything with thick ice, making all movement treacherous. Trees broke under the ice weight, destroying potential fuel sources and creating hazards. Ice accumulation could damage buildings, and ice-coated paths made even simple tasks like fetching water potentially fatal if a fall occurred. Floods could occur when rapid thaws melted accumulated snow and ice, or when heavy winter rains combined with frozen ground that couldn't absorb water. Villages in flood-prone areas faced inundation of cottages, destruction of food stores, and loss of livestock. The combination of flood and cold was particularly deadly, as wet clothing and bedding in cold weather caused rapid hypothermia. When food stores ran out before spring, whether due to poor harvests, loss to spoilage or vermin, or simply insufficient storage, peasants faced starvation. The responses to food crisis reveal much about medieval society's resilience and its limitations. The first response was to stretch remaining food as far as possible. Bread might be made with increasing proportions of filler, ground peas or beans mixed with grain flour, or even sawdust, bark, or clay. Pottage became thinner, extended with more water and whatever wild plants could be found. Rationing became severe, with household members receiving smaller portions and fewer meals. Gleaning and foraging intensified. Even in winter, some food sources existed in the wild. In mild weather, peasants might gather nuts that had been missed in autumn, dig for roots, strip inner bark from trees, or collect moss and lichens. Some wild plants remained accessible even under snow. Desperation drove people to consume foods normally rejected. Hunting and trapping small game became more important. While forests were legally controlled and hunting restrictions applied, starving peasants took risks to trap rabbits, squirrels, birds, or any other creature that might provide calories. The penalties for poaching, which could include fines, physical punishment, or even death, were weighed against the certainty of starvation. Barter and trade within the community allowed some redistribution. Families with remaining food might trade for labor, goods, or services from those without. However, in widespread food shortage, few households had surplus to trade, and the terms of barter might be exploitative, with desperate families giving up valuable tools or animals for small amounts of food. Charity from the church or from lords might provide some relief. Church doctrine mandated charity to the poor, and some parishes and monasteries did distribute food during crises. However, the capacity was limited, and in widespread famine, even institutional resources were quickly exhausted. Migration was a last resort. In extreme famine, peasants might abandon their homes and villages, wandering in search of food. This was a desperate measure. Serfs who fled their manors were legally liable, and without social networks in new locations, survival was uncertain. Roads filled with hungry refugees during major famines, and mortality among these displaced people was catastrophic. Mortality from starvation wasn't always direct. More often, malnutrition weakened people, making them susceptible to disease. The combination of hunger, cold, and infection killed millions during medieval famines like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Fire emergencies. House fires were among the most feared disasters. A fire could destroy a family's shelter, possessions, food stores, and even lives in minutes. The response to fire emergencies was necessarily swift and communal. When fire broke out, the first priority was evacuating people. The cottage was small enough that smoke and flames would fill the space rapidly, leaving little time for escape. If the fire occurred at night when everyone was sleeping, the risk of fatalities was high. Smoke inhalation could incapacitate people before they could escape. Once people were safe, attention turned to saving portable possessions and food stores. Grain stores, preserved foods, tools, and livestock might be carried or herded to safety if time permitted. However, The rapid spread of fire through thatched roofs and wooden structures often left no time for salvage operations. Fighting the fire itself was usually futile once a thatch roof ignited. The effort instead focused on preventing spread to adjacent buildings. Neighbors would rally with buckets of water or snow in winter, attempting to wet down neighboring roofs and walls. In densely built villages, fire could spread rapidly from building to building, threatening the entire community. The aftermath of a house fire in winter was potentially fatal. A family that lost their shelter in midwinter faced immediate crisis. While community norms required neighbors to provide temporary shelter, a family that had lost their home, possessions, and food stores was reduced to complete dependency. Rebuilding was possible but took time. In winter, when some building materials were difficult to obtain and work conditions harsh, rebuilding might not be feasible until spring. The family would have to crowd in with relatives or neighbors for months, an imposition on already cramped households and strained resources. Some families never recovered from devastating fires. If they had no kin to help and couldn't rebuild, they might be forced to leave their landholding and join the ranks of landless laborers or beggars. This demonstrates how a single disaster could permanently alter a family's social and economic status. Illness epidemics. While major plague epidemics are well known, smaller-scale disease outbreaks occurred regularly and were particularly devastating in winter when people were already stressed by cold and hunger. Respiratory infections could spread rapidly through a village. The combination of crowded cottages, smoke-filled air, malnutrition, and cold created ideal conditions for respiratory disease transmission. An outbreak of what we might call influenza or pneumonia could kill significant portions of a village population, especially children and the elderly. The response to epidemic illness was limited by medical knowledge and resources. Sick individuals were cared for by family but rarely isolated effectively. Folk remedies were applied, prayers offered, and the priest called to administer last rites to the dying. Beyond this, little could be done. Some communities attempted crude quarantine measures during serious epidemics, forbidding travel in or out of affected villages. However, enforcement was difficult, and people desperate for food or help might break quarantine. The effectiveness of these measures was limited at best. Epidemics had cascading effects. When multiple household members fell ill simultaneously, essential tasks went undone. Fires might be neglected, animals unfed, food unprepared. If the primary workers died, remaining household members, perhaps children or elderly, had to assume tasks they were unprepared for, often unsuccessfully. Village-level impacts were severe. An epidemic might kill the blacksmith, the midwife, the miller, people with specialized skills not easily replaced. The loss of these individuals affected the entire community's function. Agricultural knowledge holders, those who knew when to plant, how to manage particular local conditions, might die, and their knowledge died with them. Accidents and injuries. Winter brought particular risks of accidents and injuries, and without modern medical care, even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Falls on ice were common and could result in broken bones, head injuries, or simply severe bruises. A broken leg or arm was serious. The injury would be splinted and bound, but healing was uncertain. Complications like infection could turn a broken bone into a fatal injury. Even if the injury healed, the person was incapacitated for weeks or months, unable to work or contribute to household survival. Burns from hearth fires, boiling water, or hot cooking equipment occurred regularly in the confined space around the fire. Severe burns had high mortality rates. Infection was nearly inevitable, and the pain was managed only with crude remedies. Even minor burns could become infected and cause serious illness. Cuts and puncture wounds from tools, animal injuries, or thorns could introduce infection. Without understanding of germ theory, wound care was rudimentary. Washing with water or wine, application of various poultices, and bandaging. Sometimes these methods worked, sometimes they didn't. Any wound could potentially lead to fatal infection. Frostbite affecting fingers, toes, ears, or nose could result in tissue death requiring amputation. While crude amputations could be performed, typically by the local barber surgeon if one was available, the procedure was dangerous and often led to death from infection or blood loss. Those who survived amputation faced life with permanent disability in a society with no accommodation for the disabled. The absence of one adult member due to injury could precipitate household crisis. If the man was injured and couldn't work, the family lost its primary labor capacity for field work and heavy tasks. If the woman was incapacitated, food preparation, childcare, and household management suffered. Without insurance or social safety nets, each accident was potentially catastrophic. Death and its aftermath. Despite all survival efforts, death was a common occurrence. How families handled death reveals much about medieval society's practical and spiritual approaches to loss. When death appeared imminent, the priest would be called if possible to administer last rites, confession, communion, and anointing with holy oil. This prepared the dying person's soul for judgment and provided comfort to both the dying and the surviving family. In remote areas or severe weather, the priest might not be able to reach the dying in time, which caused great distress to medieval believers who feared dying without sacramental preparation. After death, the body was washed and laid out, usually by women of the household or community. The body might be wrapped in a shroud, simple cloth winding the body, as coffins were expensive luxuries most peasants couldn't afford. The body would lie in the cottage while arrangements were made for burial, typically 1 to 3 days depending on weather and circumstances. Burial in the churchyard was required by church law, and fees were charged. Poor families struggled to pay these fees but usually managed, as the community understood that proper Christian burial was essential for the soul's fate. The grave would be dug, difficult work in winter when the ground might be frozen, and a simple service conducted by the priest. The death of a household head created an immediate succession crisis. If a man died leaving a widow and children, the landholding's future was uncertain. Widows had some rights but were vulnerable. A widow might maintain the holding if she had adult sons to work it, or she might remarry quickly to a man who could assume the labor. If she had neither, she might lose the holding and be reduced to poverty. The death of a wife and mother was equally catastrophic. Widowers with young children faced the challenge of maintaining household functions, food preparation, child care, textile work, that women traditionally performed. Remarriage was nearly essential, but finding a new wife willing to assume care of another woman's children was not always easy. Child deaths, while common, were grieved deeply. Christian theology promised that properly baptized infants who died would go to heaven, providing some comfort. Children who died were usually buried with less ceremony than adults, though they still required consecrated ground burial. The cumulative grief of losing multiple children was a burden most medieval parents carried. The far northern regions of medieval Europe faced winter conditions more severe than most of the continent. Peasants in Scandinavia, northern Scotland, and Russia developed specialized adaptations to survive months of extreme cold and limited daylight. Housing construction in these regions reflected climatic demands. Scandinavian peasants often built semi-subterranean structures, Longhouses partially dug into the earth with thick turf walls and roofs. Earth provided excellent insulation, and the portion below ground level benefited from the Earth's constant temperature, which, while cold, was warmer than surface air in winter. The Scandinavian longhouse typically housed humans and animals under one roof, separated by a passage but sharing warmth. This arrangement was taken to greater extremes than in milder climates, with cattle stalls often integrated directly into the living structure. The body heat from a dozen or more cattle could significantly warm the human living space. Stockpiling fuel was even more critical in northern regions. Where forests existed, enormous wood piles were accumulated during the short summer. In treeless areas like Iceland, peat, dried dung, and driftwood were hoarded obsessively. Running out of fuel meant death, so fuel reserves received highest priority. Food preservation techniques included unique adaptations. In Scandinavia and Iceland, the practice of producing lutefisk, fish preserved in lye, and other strongly preserved foods provided nutrition through long winters. Skyr, fermented dairy product, and other preserved dairy could supplement winter diets. The winter darkness of far northern latitudes created particular psychological challenges. In the far north, the sun might not rise for weeks or months. This extended darkness affected mood and activity patterns, and communities developed cultural practices, storytelling, crafts, social gatherings, to maintain morale through the dark period. Clothing in northern regions featured fur and leather more prominently than in southern areas. While wool remained important, animal furs provided superior warmth for outer garments. Fur caps, mittens, and boots were essential survival gear. The poor might use rabbit or hare fur, while those who could afford it used sheep, goat, or even bear pelts. Mediterranean and Southern European approaches. Southern European peasants faced different winter challenges. While less severely cold, Mediterranean winters brought rain, wind, and occasional hard freezes that could destroy crops not adapted to such conditions. Housing in Mediterranean regions used stone more extensively than northern areas, as stone was abundant and would scarcer. Stone provided good thermal mass. It absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, moderating temperature swings. However, stone also conducted cold when outside temperatures dropped. Olive oil production in Mediterranean regions provided a resource that had multiple winter uses. Olive oil was burned in lamps, providing better light than tallow candles. It was used in cooking and preserved foods. It could even be applied to skin to protect against wind and cold, and used as medicine. Wine production in southern regions meant that peasants often had access to wine rather than ale as their daily beverage. Wine production used different technology than ale brewing and produced a product that stored better without refrigeration, important in warmer climates where spoilage was faster. Diet in Mediterranean regions included more diverse foods even in winter. Preserved olives, dried figs and other fruits, preserved fish like salted anchovy, and a wider variety of grain types, including wheat more commonly than in the north, gave southern peasants somewhat better nutrition. Winter work in southern regions included different tasks. Olive harvest occurred in late autumn and early winter, providing labor opportunities. Pruning of grapevines and fruit trees was winter work. These agricultural tasks continued through winter in ways that northern field agriculture did not, affecting the rhythm of life. The psychological experience of winter was different in the South. While cold and hunger were still real threats, the winter darkness was less oppressive than in the North. Days were shorter than summer but never reached the extreme darkness of northern latitudes. This affected mood and activity levels. However, southern peasants faced different climate challenges. Rain and dampness could be as threatening as northern cold. Stone houses with inadequate roofing could become miserably wet, and the combination of wet and cold caused illness. Flash flooding was a greater risk than in most northern regions. Eastern European and continental approaches. Eastern Europe's continental climate brought extremely cold, dry winters quite different from the damp cold of Atlantic Europe. Peasants in regions from Poland through Russia face temperature extremes, but often with less precipitation than Western regions. The dry cold of continental climates required different strategies than damp cold. While absolute temperatures were often lower, the lack of moisture meant that proper clothing and shelter could be very effective. Dry cold was in some ways more manageable than the penetrating damp cold of Western Europe. The Russian-style izba, peasant cottage, represented adaptations to extreme cold. These log structures featured small windows, low ceilings, and most notably, large masonry stoves, called pesh, that dominated the living space. The pesh was both heating source and sleeping platform. Family members slept on top of the warm masonry, which retained heat for hours after the fire died down. Felt and animal fur figured more prominently in Eastern European peasant clothing and housing. Felt boots, valenki in Russian, provided excellent insulation for feet. Sheepskin coats with wool inside were superior winter garments compared to woven wool cloth alone. Food preservation in eastern regions emphasized different techniques. Fermentation of vegetables, sauerkraut, and other fermented foods was even more central to winter diet than in western regions. The cold, dry climate allowed some foods to be preserved simply by freezing, though this had to be managed carefully as repeated freeze-thaw cycles damaged food quality. The vastness of Eastern European landscapes meant communities were more isolated than in the densely settled West. This isolation meant that outside help during crisis was unlikely. Each village and each household had to be entirely self-sufficient. This necessity drove even more careful preparation and stockpiling than in regions where neighbors were closer. Mountain regions and alpine adaptations. Mountain peasants throughout Europe faced unique challenges: extreme cold, deep snow, isolation, and steep terrain that affected every aspect of life. Alpine housing featured distinctive adaptations. Chalets with ground-floor stone construction and upper-story wood were common, with animal quarters on the ground floor providing heat to human quarters above. Steep-pitched roofs shed snow effectively, and small windows minimized heat loss. Transhumance, seasonal movement of livestock, shaped the annual cycle. While lowland peasants kept animals near homes year-round, alpine peasants moved livestock to high summer pastures and brought them to valley settlements for winter. This movement concentrated animals and people in protected areas during winter. Snow management was essential survival skill. Avalanche risk meant some areas were uninhabitable in winter, and peasants had to recognize signs of avalanche danger. Snow accumulation had to be cleared from roofs and paths regularly. Snow itself could be used as insulation. Building snow banks against cottage walls provided additional protection from wind. Mountain peasants developed specialized equipment for winter survival. Snowshoes or skis in the far north allowed movement through deep snow. Ice picks and crampons aided travel on icy slopes. Sleds for transporting loads over snow were essential. Food preservation in mountains included unique methods. The cold, dry air of high altitudes was excellent for air-drying meat and fish. Some alpine communities produced air-dried meats, like prosciutto or Bündnerfleisch, that could keep for extended periods. Cheese production in summer provided high-calorie, concentrated nutrition for winter. Isolation was even more extreme in mountains than in other regions. Winter storms could close mountain passes for weeks or months, completely cutting off communities from outside contact. Each mountain village had to be entirely self-sufficient, unable to rely on trade or outside help. The psychological impact of mountain winter isolation was significant. Small communities essentially imprisoned by snow for months developed close social bonds but also experienced tensions from the enforced proximity. Folk traditions, music, and craft work helped maintain morale through the long isolation. The end of winter was anticipated eagerly but came gradually. The transition from winter to spring was not abrupt but rather a period of fluctuating conditions that could bring both hope and renewed danger. The lengthening of days was the first sure sign. Even while snow still covered the ground and temperatures remained cold, the gradually earlier sunrise and later sunset provided psychological relief. More daylight meant more time for outdoor work and less time confined to dim, smoky cottages. Wildlife returning signaled spring's approach. The first birds returning from southern migrations, swallows, storks, geese, were eagerly awaited. Their arrival suggested that warmer weather was coming, even if winter cold might return temporarily. The breeding behavior of local animals, birds nesting, animals emerging from hibernation, provided additional evidence of seasonal change. Early spring weather was notoriously unreliable. Warm days might be followed by hard freezes, and late winter storms could be devastating. The phrase blackthorn winter referred to late cold snaps that occurred when blackthorn trees bloomed, a reminder that winter wasn't truly finished until later than the calendar suggested. This transition period brought particular dangers. Melting snow created floods, roads became impassable mud, and diseases spread in the warmer, wetter conditions. The combination of melting snow, spring rains, and still frozen ground created waterlogged conditions that bred illness and made all movement difficult. Food supplies were at their lowest in early spring, the hungry gap, when stored food was exhausted but new crops were not yet available. This was the most dangerous time of year for malnutrition and starvation. Even as weather improved, peasants might be weaker and more vulnerable than at any time during winter itself. The first tasks of spring. As soon as weather permitted, peasants rushed to begin spring tasks that would determine the success of the coming year. The timing was critical. Starting too early risked wasting effort on work that cold weather would undo, but starting too late meant losing precious growing season days. Field preparation was the first priority. Frozen ground had to thaw enough to be workable. Peasants would test the soil, waiting for it to dry sufficiently that plowing would not create massive, unworkable clods. Once conditions were right, plowing began, breaking the rested winter ground and preparing it for spring planting. Spring grain planting followed immediately. Oats, barley, and other spring crops had to be planted as soon as possible to take advantage of the entire growing season. The timing of planting could make the difference between adequate harvest and famine the following winter, so peasants watched weather and soil conditions carefully. Animal care intensified. Livestock that had survived winter on minimal feed needed improved nutrition as grass began growing. Pregnant animals giving birth required attention. Birthing season for cattle, sheep, and goats occurred in spring, and successful births meant more animals, more dairy, more meat for winter, and more draft power for field work. Buildings and tools required repair. Damage that occurred during winter, leaking roofs, broken tools, damaged fences, had to be fixed before the busy farming season began in earnest. Spring was a brief window when this maintenance work could be accomplished before field labor demanded all available time. Gardens needed planting. Early spring vegetables, Peas, lettuce, onions could be planted as soon as ground could be worked. These early crops would provide the first fresh food after months of preserved stores, and their importance for both nutrition and morale cannot be overstated. The survival of medieval peasants through the harsh winters that characterized much of the medieval period stands as a testament to human adaptability, ingenuity, and resilience. These people, living with resources that would seem impossibly meager by modern standards, managed not merely to survive but to maintain communities, raise families, and preserve cultures through centuries of challenging winters. Their success rested on multiple interconnected foundations. Physical strategies, efficient use of fire and fuel, careful food preservation, maximizing body heat through co-sleeping and animal proximity, layered clothing, and well-maintained shelter formed the practical basis of survival. Each element, from the banked hearth fire to the straw-filled sleeping platform, represented accumulated knowledge refined over generations. Yet physical preparations alone were insufficient. The social structures of medieval peasant society, the manor system with its reciprocal, if unequal, obligations, the village community with its cooperative labor and resource sharing, the extended family household with its pooled resources and mutual support, created networks that buffered individuals against the worst effects of winter hardship. When one family's grain store failed, neighbors shared. When fire destroyed a cottage, the community provided shelter. When illness struck, family members provided care. These social bonds, enforced by both practical necessity and cultural expectations, were as essential to winter survival as adequate fuel stores. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of medieval winter survival should not be underestimated. The structure provided by the church calendar, with its festivals, holy days, and rhythms of feast and fast, gave meaning to suffering and temporal markers that divided the long winter into manageable segments. The shared stories told around evening hearths, the songs sung during communal work, the prayers offered in times of crisis. These cultural practices maintained morale and reinforced community identity through the darkest months. Medieval peasants understood, perhaps more clearly than modern people insulated by technology, their fundamental dependence on forces beyond their control. Weather, disease, and chance could destroy the most careful preparations. This awareness fostered both a stoic acceptance of hardship and a fierce determination to control what could be controlled. Every task had its proper time and method, every resource had to be used efficiently, and constant vigilance was necessary. Yet this was balanced by acknowledgement that, ultimately, survival depended on divine providence as much as human effort. The cost of winter survival was significant. High mortality rates, especially among the very young and very old, meant that every spring brought grief to communities that had lost members to cold, hunger, and disease. Chronic malnutrition, exposure to smoke and cold, and the physical toll of constant labor meant that even those who survived faced shortened lifespans and diminished health. The psychological burden of endless winter darkness, confined spaces, and the constant presence of death shaped medieval worldviews in profound ways. Regional variations across Europe's diverse climates and geographies produced different adaptations, but common themes emerged everywhere. The critical importance of community cooperation, the integration of human and animal survival strategies, the necessity of careful planning and resource management, and the central role of fire in making life possible. Whether in the semi-subterranean longhouses of Scandinavia, the stone cottages of Mediterranean hillsides, or the timber and daub structures of northern France, peasants developed solutions appropriate to their particular circumstances while drawing on shared cultural knowledge. The transition from winter to spring, anticipated eagerly through the long dark months, brought both relief and renewed danger. The Hungry Gap, when food stores ran out before new crops became available, was perhaps the most dangerous time of year. Yet spring also brought renewal, longer days, returning warmth, the promise of new growth, and relief from winter's confinement. The cyclical nature of this struggle, repeated year after year, created a worldview that accepted hardship as inevitable while celebrating survival and renewal. Modern people, accustomed to heated homes, abundant food year-round, and protection from the elements, can barely comprehend the realities of medieval peasant life. Yet understanding how our ancestors survived and sometimes thrived under conditions we would consider impossible offers important perspectives. It reminds us of human resilience and adaptability. It illustrates the fundamental importance of community and mutual support. It demonstrates that quality of life cannot be measured solely in material terms. Medieval peasants found meaning, joy, and purpose in lives that were objectively harsh by modern standards. The medieval peasant's knowledge, how to bank a fire to last the night, when to plant by reading weather signs, which wild plants could save a family from starvation, how to preserve food for months without refrigeration, represented genuine expertise developed through necessity and refined through generations. Much of this knowledge has been lost in the modern era, but it reminds us that technological simplicity does not mean lack of sophistication. The medieval peasant facing winter with an axe, a hearth fire, and accumulated wisdom was employing a complex survival strategy as sophisticated, in its way, as modern centralized heating systems. Perhaps most importantly, the story of medieval peasants surviving winter demonstrates that humans can endure extraordinary hardship when supported by strong communities, guided by accumulated knowledge, and sustained by hope. Whether hope for spring's arrival, hope for divine intervention, or simply hope that tomorrow might be marginally better than today. The fires that burned in medieval peasant hearths through countless winter nights were more than just sources of physical warmth. They were symbols of the indomitable human spirit, refusing to be extinguished by cold, darkness, or despair. As we face our own challenges in the modern era, whether climate change, social disruption, or personal hardships, there may be lessons in the resilience of medieval peasants. Their survival was achieved not through individual heroism but through cooperation, careful stewardship of resources, acceptance of what could not be changed, and fierce determination to preserve what could be preserved. They remind us that humans have survived desperate circumstances before, that community matters more than individual wealth, and that even in the darkest times, spring eventually comes. The medieval peasant who successfully kept the hearth fire alive through another winter night, who shared bread with a hungry neighbor, who told stories to children huddled in the darkness, who prayed for better days and worked to make them possible. These people were our ancestors, and their survival made our existence possible. Their story is one of suffering and loss, certainly, but also of courage, ingenuity, and an unquenchable determination to survive, to preserve community and family, and to pass their knowledge and culture on to the next generation. In remembering how they survived the coldest nights, we honor their memory and perhaps gain perspective on our own challenges and blessings.